I never expected my life to revolve around hospital corridors, medication charts, and insurance paperwork. But that became my reality the day my father suffered a stroke. Overnight, I went from being a graphic designer with a manageable routine to a full-time caregiver juggling two part-time jobs just to keep us afloat. The air in his small recovery room always smelled faintly of disinfectant and wilted flowers, a constant reminder of how fragile things had become. Whenever I stood beside his bed, adjusting his blankets or helping him eat, the weight of everything hit me square in the chest. But I kept telling myself that family steps up when it matters. My older brother Jason, however, apparently hadn't gotten that memo. Growing up, he was always the golden boy, charming, athletic, the one our parents bragged about to relatives. I was the responsible one, the one who cleaned up behind him, the one who remembered birthdays and paid bills. So when Dad got sick, I assumed Jason would finally show up and share the load. Instead, every call I made was met with the same tired excuse. I just don't have the money right now. Things are tight. The first few times, I believed him. His voice sounded strained. And I knew the construction company he worked for had gone through layoffs the year before. But as months passed and Dad's medical bills climbed, Jason's excuses became more rehearsed, almost like he practiced them before answering my calls. "You don't understand," he'd say, adopting a condescending tone that made my blood pressure spike. "I have responsibilities too." Responsibilities apparently meant maintaining the lifestyle he'd grown comfortable with while I drained my savings to keep Dad in physical therapy. Dad never complained, but the guilt poured out of him in quiet ways, a long sigh when I showed him another bill, or the way his eyes dropped every time I waved away his apologies. I could tell he hated relying on me, hated feeling like a burden, and hated that Jason wasn't stepping up, even though he pretended otherwise. Dr. Monroe had warned me early on that recovery would be slow and unpredictable, and each setback felt like a fresh blow. Still, I held everything together with duct tape and determination, telling myself that relief had to be around the corner. But relief never came. Instead, the phone calls with Jason grew more tense, and the gaps between them widened. When he did answer, he always sounded distracted, like he was doing me a favor by simply picking up. Meanwhile, I was losing sleep, staying up late at the kitchen table surrounded by Dad's paperwork, highlighted medical statements, and my own overdrawn checking account notifications. I hated feeling resentful, but the bitterness crept in anyway, filling the space where hope used to sit. It got to the point where I stopped asking him to help, because the humiliation of being dismissed hurt more than the struggle. Marissa, his wife, tried to play the middle ground. Whenever I saw her at family gatherings, she'd offer sympathetic smiles and soft comments like, "I'm so sorry you're carrying all this, Emily." But she never contradicted Jason when he claimed he couldn't contribute. Sometimes I caught her looking at me with a tight-lipped expression, like she wanted to say something but couldn't, or wouldn't. The silence between us started to feel like a secret she didn't know how to hold. One evening, after a particularly long day where Dad had struggled to move his right leg and burst into tears out of frustration, I collapsed onto the couch with my laptop. My eyes burned from exhaustion, but I knew I had to check my accounts and plan for the next round of bills. As I scrolled through my budgeting app, calculating what else I could cut out of my life, a notification popped up from social media, a tagged post connected to someone I vaguely recognized. I clicked on it without thinking, my brain on autopilot. But the second the image loaded, my exhaustion evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping sharpness. It was Jason. Not haggard, not stressed, not broke. He was smiling, standing next to something shiny and new, his arm draped proudly across it while friends congratulated him in the comments. My pulse quickened as I stared at the picture, reading the caption twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The realization struck me with such force that I sat upright, heart pounding harder with every second. Every excuse he'd fed me suddenly made perfect, infuriating sense. And the truth I had been too tired, too trusting, or too loyal to see had been right in front of me all along. Things were about to get much worse. The night after I saw that picture, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jason's stupid grin in front of that brand new truck, shiny, spotless, and definitely not something a financially struggling man could afford. I kept replaying all the conversations where he swore he had nothing extra to give, each excuse sounding faker in hindsight. My anger didn't burn hot. It simmered low and steady, tightening my chest until breathing felt difficult. By sunrise, I knew I couldn't let this go. I drove straight to Dad's house, determined to keep things normal for him until I had a plan. The smell of his morning coffee and the soft sound of his classical radio station usually calmed me, but not today. I kept forcing a smile, helping him with his exercises while my mind spun in 1,000 angry directions. Dad watched me with those wise, tired eyes, and I could tell he sensed something was wrong. But he didn't press. Maybe because he knew I was already carrying too much. By noon, I finally called Jason. I expected voicemail, but he answered on the second ring, sounding annoyingly cheerful. When I asked him calmly how he managed to buy a new truck if he was so broke, the shift in his voice was immediate. He went from upbeat to defensive in 3 seconds flat, accusing me of snooping and jumping to conclusions. Then he said the line that made me want to throw my phone across the room. "Emily, you don't understand finances. There are ways to afford things without having actual money." His tone was smug, like he believed he was the intelligent one in this conversation. I reminded him again that Dad's medical bills were piling up and that I needed help, not arrogance. Jason sighed dramatically and told me I was overreacting, that his purchase was an investment, and that it wasn't my place to question his financial choices. It was such an absurd response that I had to sit down to stop myself from shaking. That truck had cost at least 40 grand, and he acted like questioning him was some kind of personal attack. When I hung up, I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. The conversation wasn't just unhelpful, it was revealing. Jason wasn't struggling, he was hiding, and the more I thought about it, the more inconsistencies I remembered. The sudden vacations he took last year, the designer watches, the multiple weekends where he claimed he was working overtime, but posted photos from expensive restaurants. All the pieces were finally sliding into place, and none of it looked good. Later that week, I took Dad to physical therapy, and while he was in session, I chatted with Mrs. Hawkins, his neighbor and longtime friend. She mentioned casually that she'd seen Jason around the neighborhood recently, driving something flashy, and had assumed he was doing well. I forced a smile, but inside I felt like my stomach was free-falling. If Jason could show off his new purchases to neighbors but lie to me, it was clear he didn't feel even an ounce of guilt, realizing that hurt more than the financial betrayal itself. That afternoon, I got a message from Marissa asking if we could talk privately. We met at a small cafe downtown, and she looked uncomfortable from the moment she sat down. She stirred her coffee so nervously it sloshed over the rim, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She said she knew Jason should be helping with Dad, and that she didn't agree with how he handled things. But whenever I pressed for details, she froze and shook her head, saying, "He'd lose it if he knew I talked to you." Her fear told me everything her words didn't. I walked back to my car with a heaviness that clung to me like wet clothes. It wasn't just that Jason refused to help, it was that he had built an entire system of secrecy around himself, a system that even his own wife tiptoed around. I sat in my car for a long minute, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm the storm racing through my mind. Then my phone buzzed with a new notification. It was a photo sent anonymously. At first, I frowned, assuming it was spam, but when I opened it, my pulse spiked. It was Jason again, this time standing beside a different purchase I hadn't seen before. Something expensive. Something he definitely couldn't justify. There was no message attached. Just the photo. And suddenly, I had the feeling someone knew more about my brother than even I did. Things weren't just getting worse, they were unraveling. The anonymous photo haunted me for days. It showed Jason standing in a private electronics boutique, holding a sleek, high-end drone that easily cost several $1,000s. His smile was wide, his posture cocky, and he looked nothing like a man buried under financial hardship. Every time I looked at the picture, a new wave of disbelief washed through me, followed quickly by anger. It wasn't the purchase itself, it was the blatant mockery of everything I'd been doing to keep Dad alive and cared for. I didn't know who had sent the photo, but I knew one thing. Whoever it was wanted me to see it. That mystery gnawed at me, pushing me deeper into suspicion. I began checking Jason's social media pages more closely, scrolling through every tagged post, comment, and picture. Most things were locked down or curated carefully, but people in his circle were less cautious. Within minutes, I found another post him standing proudly near a resort pool from a work retreat he supposedly couldn't afford. The timestamp correlated with a weekend he claimed he'd been sick and couldn't watch Dad. That discovery was the breaking point. I printed the anonymous photo, the resort picture, and others I'd found online, laying them across my dining table like puzzle pieces. As I stared at them, I remembered how Dad had once trusted Jason to help with his finances during his early decline. He'd given Jason access to a joint emergency fund just in case something ever happened. Back then, I never questioned it, because Jason was the golden child, the one Dad believed would step up if needed. Now, the thought made my stomach twist. I decided to visit Uncle Robert, my dad's older brother, who had always been the family's quiet observer. He lived about 20 minutes away in a modest brick house, and when he opened the door, his face softened with concern as soon as he saw my expression. We sat in his living room, the sound of an old clock ticking steadily behind us, and I told him everything from the bills Jason refused to help with to the string of expensive purchases. Uncle Robert listened carefully, his hands clasped tightly, his brow furrowed deeper with every piece of evidence I laid out. When I finished, he took a long breath before speaking, and what he said made my skin prickle. Months before Dad's stroke, Jason had asked him about estate procedures and how joint accounts worked. At the time, Uncle Robert assumed Jason was trying to be responsible, maybe preparing for the future. But now, with everything I'd shown him, he suspected Jason had been planning something long before any emergency actually happened. His voice grew strained as he admitted he had warned Dad not to give Jason full access. But Dad, a trusting man by nature, believed in his son. "What kind of access did he have?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Uncle Robert hesitated, then said Jason had been added to an account Dad had kept for decades, money set aside for emergencies, future medical needs, and anything that could protect him in old age. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me as I realized the implications. If Jason had control, and if he'd been lying about his finances, then the money funding his new lifestyle might not be his at all. My heartbeat quickened at the thought of Dad's life savings disappearing behind my back. Determined to get answers, I went home and began digging deeper. I searched public records, financial directories, even the dealership page from the truck Jason bought. That's when I saw it. The dealership had posted a congratulatory photo the same week Jason told me he couldn't afford Dad's medication refill. My hands shook as I stared at the date, the truth hitting me like ice water. Every struggle, every hardship, every excuse had been a lie covered in feigned pity and fake stress. I gathered all the evidence into a folder and sat alone at the kitchen table, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the wall clock. The house felt too quiet, as though it were holding its breath with me. I thought of Dad sleeping in the next room, trusting us, believing we were working together to support him. The betrayal wasn't just against me, it was against him, the man who had raised us, loved us, and believed in Jason long after he deserved it. The next morning, while I was organizing Dad's medication for the week, I found an unopened envelope tucked behind a stack of hospital discharge papers. It was addressed not to Dad, but to me. My chest tightened as I tore it open, expecting a bill or some forgotten instruction. Instead, what slid onto the table made every hair on my arm stand up. Bank statements. Statements showing withdrawals I never authorized. Withdrawals made by Jason, and the dates matched every single major purchase he'd made. In that moment, I realized my brother hadn't just been lying, he had been stealing from our father right under my nose. And the truth was only just beginning to surface. By the time I finished reviewing the bank statements, my hands were trembling so badly I had to sit down. Each withdrawal was perfectly timed, always just under amounts that would trigger automatic fraud alerts and spaced out enough to appear routine. But seeing the pattern laid out in front of me made everything horrifyingly clear. Jason hadn't stumbled into debt or made a few irresponsible choices. He had deliberately siphoned money out of our father's emergency fund while pretending to be financially strapped and emotionally overwhelmed. I knew I couldn't confront him alone. That kind of betrayal wasn't something to bring into a shouting match on a front porch or over a family dinner. So I called our family attorney, Miss Delgado, a calm but razor-sharp woman who had handled Dad's paperwork for years. When she invited me to her office the next morning, I gathered all the documents, printed screenshots, time-stamped photos, and the dreadful bank statements. Driving there felt surreal, like I was heading into a battle I never imagined I'd have to fight with my own brother. Miss Delgado studied everything in silence, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern to unmistakable anger. When she finally leaned back in her chair, she tapped her pen against the stack of papers and said, "This is serious, very serious." Her voice held none of the softness she usually reserved for sensitive family cases. She explained that not only had Jason abused his access to Dad's finances, but some of the withdrawals given Dad's medical status could legally qualify as exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The phrase made my stomach drop like a stone. She asked if Dad had ever signed over durable financial power of attorney to Jason. I shook my head immediately, but she still checked her files to be sure. When she confirmed that I was the only designated decision-maker for Dad's medical and financial matters, her eyes narrowed. Any withdrawal Jason made after Dad's stroke wasn't just unethical, it was potentially criminal. Hearing it stated so plainly left me stunned, the reality sinking deeper than ever before. After reviewing everything, Miss Delgado said she would set up a family meeting at her office. She insisted on the neutral environment and the formal tone to prevent Jason from spinning lies or turning the situation into emotional chaos. A part of me dreaded the idea of facing him, but another part felt an unfamiliar, righteous determination. This wasn't about sibling rivalry or resentment over responsibility. It was about protecting my father, something Jason clearly had no intention of doing. The meeting was scheduled for 2 days later. Those 2 days dragged like entire seasons, filled with anxious pacing, sleepless nights, and stolen glances at Dad as he rested in his recliner. Every time I looked at him, a wave of guilt rose inside me. Guilt that I hadn't caught this sooner, that I had believed Jason when he said he was struggling, that I had given him the benefit of the doubt again and again. Dad had always trusted us to look out for each other. I wondered what he would think if he knew what his firstborn son had done. When the day finally came, I arrived early to Miss Delgado's office, my folder clutched tightly in my hands. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, and the long table between us felt symbolic, solid, unmovable, ready to divide truth from deception. Jason arrived 10 minutes late, breezing in with expensive sunglasses on his head and a designer jacket slung over his arm. When he saw me and the attorney sitting together, the confidence in his stride faltered for just a second, but he quickly recovered with a casual smirk. Miss Delgado wasted no time. She presented the bank statements, photos, receipts, and matching dates, laying them out like pieces of a criminal puzzle. Jason's face shifted through a kaleidoscope of reactions: confusion, annoyance, defensiveness, and finally, something like panic. He tried to laugh at first, saying the withdrawals were for household things Dad needed, or emergency home repairs. But Miss Delgado calmly countered each excuse with documented evidence that no such repairs or purchases had been made. When she mentioned the legal definition of financial exploitation, Jason's bravado cracked. He leaned back, crossing his arms tightly, his jaw clenching with every word she spoke. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he snapped, directing his frustration at me as if I were the one stealing money. He insisted Dad had told him he could use the account as needed. But Miss Delgado reminded him that Dad's condition meant any such approval would not be legally valid after his decline, and that I was the authorized decision-maker. His voice rose, his defensiveness turning hostile, accusing me of setting him up, of being jealous, of always wanting to control everything. I felt the sting of his words, but I didn't flinch. For once, I wasn't shrinking back, trying to keep the peace or avoid conflict. I looked him directly in the eyes and told him that Dad's care came first, and that his lies had gone on long enough. When Miss Delgado informed him of the next step, an audit of all account activity and possible legal action, Jason's face drained of color. He didn't argue anymore. He just stared at the documents, realizing the situation had slipped out of his hands. As he gathered his jacket and stormed out, the quiet that followed felt heavy and final. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of everything settle around me. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The silence after Jason stormed out of the attorney's office lingered long after he was gone, settling into the room like dust that refused to be brushed away. I stayed seated for several minutes, trying to steady my breathing as the reality of what had happened finally sank in. Confronting my own brother felt like a wound I had inflicted on myself, even though I knew I had done the right thing. The weight of betrayal pressed against my ribs, but beneath it, there was also a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't second-guessing myself or allowing guilt to convince me to stay quiet. Miss Delgado reassured me that the next steps were straightforward, even if they weren't easy. She would begin the financial audit immediately, gathering records from the past year to determine the full scope of Jason's withdrawals. Depending on what the audit revealed, she might have to file a formal petition with the court to protect the remainder of Dad's assets. The thought of dragging this into a courtroom made my stomach twist, but I reminded myself that avoiding conflict had already cost us more than I realized. Protecting Dad had to come before protecting Jason's pride. When I returned home, Dad was sitting in his recliner watching the afternoon news, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. I sat beside him and helped adjust his blanket, feeling the familiar ache of love and responsibility swell in my chest. Part of me wanted to tell him everything, to let him know that I was fighting for him, but another part feared burdening him with something he no longer had the strength to process. Instead, I simply held his hand and promised silently that I would make things right, no matter how long it took. Over the next week, Jason avoided me entirely. No calls, no messages, not even a passive-aggressive text or a hastily typed attempt at explaining himself. He stayed silent, which worried me even more than if he had been shouting. Meanwhile, Miss Delgado kept me updated as she made progress through his financial activity. Each new discovery was another small punch to the gut. Purchases at exclusive golf courses, designer clothes, premium restaurant bills, and even payments on what looked suspiciously like a vacation package. When Miss Delgado finished her audit, the results were even worse than we expected. Jason had taken nearly $38,000 from Dad's account, over 8 months' money that should have gone toward medical treatments, home care, and basic living expenses. Seeing the final number printed in bold at the top of the report made my chest tighten. It wasn't just a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a pattern, a deliberate abuse of trust that had left Dad's savings dangerously depleted. Miss Delgado insisted we take action immediately. She drafted a formal complaint to the court, requesting that Jason be removed from any access related to Dad's finances and placed under legal scrutiny for potential exploitation. She explained that even if we didn't want to push for criminal charges, the court had to be informed due to the severity of the withdrawals. I felt a flicker of guilt again, wondering if I was going too far. But then I remembered Dad struggling to choose between prescriptions and physical therapy last month. Jason hadn't just taken money. He took away options that directly affected Dad's well-being. 2 days later, Jason finally called. His voice was shaky, brittle around the edges, sounding nothing like the confident man who had strutted into the attorney's office. He asked if we could meet, just the two of us, claiming he wanted to clear the air. I agreed, but insisted it be at a public place. When we sat across from each other at a quiet coffee shop, he looked older, worn down, and deeply uncomfortable. But even then, he couldn't fully admit what he'd done. He tried to apologize without actually accepting blame, blaming stress, work issues, and bad decisions influenced by a rough year. When I told him the audit revealed the full amount he had taken, his face paled, and he rubbed his forehead repeatedly. He said he had planned to pay it back. Eventually, a claim so flimsy it barely qualified as an excuse. I told him gently but firmly that I had already filed the complaint and that the court would determine the next steps. His eyes filled with a mix of anger and shame. But he didn't argue. The fallout unfolded quickly. The court granted me full and exclusive control over Dad's finances, ordering Jason to repay the stolen funds under a structured plan. He wasn't charged criminally, something Miss Delgado and I agreed to avoid unless he violated the repayment order, but the legal ruling still hit him hard. His access to Dad was limited temporarily, and he was required to attend a mediation session to address the breach of trust. Every part of the process felt heavy, but also necessary. Weeks passed before the dust finally settled. My relationship with Jason would never be the same, and deep down, I accepted that. Trust, once cracked, rarely returns to its original shape. But Dad was safe. His finances were stable, and the constant anxiety that had lingered in the back of my mind for months finally began to fade. Sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't feel heroic. It feels painful, exhausting, and lonely. But it is still the right thing. And as I watched Dad rest comfortably, no longer at the mercy of Jason's deceit, I realized something important. Protecting family doesn't always mean protecting harmony. Sometimes it means being the one strong enough to expose the truth, even when it hurts.